Hi, all. Welcome to this week's episode of Mission Forward. This week, we have brought back a guest that we first interviewed as part of our Community Conversations series last fall. Eric Meade is an award-winning author of 2 books, Reframing Poverty and Whole Mind Facilitation, and he's a nationally recognized facilitator who stands outside of time to help groups see their current issues in a longer-term perspective. He is smart, engaging, funny, and honest, and I appreciate the perspective he brings to this week's conversation, in which we reflect on history, we get real about how living in this time feels, and we touch on how the past can help prepare us for the future. This is a great episode, so stay tuned. Eric Meade, I am so glad to have this conversation with you today. For those who are listening, you were so gracious to have a conversation with us back last spring, not too long after the pandemic had started. We had you in on one of our community conversations that was part of our response, our company's response to COVID, and how we were bringing communities together to think through the effects in real time of COVID. And we loved that conversation. And so I am really glad and grateful for your time today as we bring that conversation forward into present day as we sit here at the beginning of 2021.
Thanks, Gary. I'm very happy to be here.
So we're going to start the way we're starting all of our shows this season to get some context for those who are listening. Tell me where you are, literally, where are you sitting? And what's one thing in your view that makes you happy?
Well, where am I? I am in my man cave in the basement that is one of the outcomes of this pandemic. And so I'm hunkered down within a house that is hunkered down. So where am I, more emotionally right now? I think I feel a new optimism. Obviously, given my politics, that's a consequence of some of the good things coming out of Washington in the past several days. It's also, we just decided this morning to send our kids back to in-person school. They had been staying at home. That may turn out to be a good decision. That may turn out to be a bad decision. But I guess the optimism is more around feeling that we are doing our best. As a country, we're now trying to do our best. And as a family, we're trying to do our best. And how it turns out, we don't know. But that's all we can hope for.
Eric, you and I are both in similar situations where we are both raising businesses and raising families at the same time. You've got still pretty little ones, don't you?
No, I've got eighth and fourth grade.
So we're in similar boats. Mine are a little bit younger than yours, but we're working through the same hard questions right now. This season, we are talking about this concept of pressing forward. How do we press forward even when we feel like the world is up against us, when we feel like we've got a rock or maybe a boulder in front of us that feels really tough to move, right? How do we keep thinking about one step in front of the next, moving forward? So much of 2020 gave us this time to think about what was standing in our way, the things that remain standing in our way, and how do we either, face those and think about it, move forward, or do they push us back a bit? And there have certainly been plenty of times when they have pushed me back. But I'm curious if you're willing to share what 2020, the experience that was 2020, teach you about your work, about your team, about yourself.
I might ask a question about the word pressing, or just raise some discussion of it, because pressing does sound like effort and work and sounds strenuous. And I just want to create the space for recognizing that a lot of people probably would be intimidated by the concept of pressing forward. It's like, heck, I'm pressing, I'm running to stand still right now. And I think a lot of people have felt that. And I think that's okay. My favorite book of the Bible is Ecclesiastes, which is all about, there's nothing new under the sun, and there's a time for different types of responses. And I think recognizing that 2020 required a different set of responses from previous years in recent memory, I think that would make sense. In terms of my own work and my own lived experience of the past year, I'd say I have come to value the long-term perspective that I have. I've long called myself a futurist, and in college I studied history. So I think I probably just have an inherently long-term perspective looking both ways that has advantages and disadvantages. One is I quickly adapt to changes in situations that I can point to precedents for. So, this pandemic is not totally unprecedented. We had something very similar 100 years ago. There have been other pandemics. I actually have an aunt, a late aunt, who had polio in the last few years of kids getting polio, and it significantly affected her life. So these types of things have happened before, and recognizing that this is part of the world we live in. And then the what I would call a failed coup that we've experienced in the past few months or few years, that is how those things happen too, and they've happened before. Hitler was elected in Germany before he decided that they weren't going to have elections anymore. So part of it is that long-term perspective, which I think as a facilitator, which is a big part of my work, I think that helps me because I'm not thrown to emotional extremes given what any organization is dealing with right now. I'm kind of like, well, these are like the 3 to 5 big human problems that we deal with. How do you want to deal with it this time? So that long-term perspective has really come to the fore as a futurist and a historian, and recognizing that probably the best place to apply a long-term perspective is in the present.
Yeah, it's a great perspective. And perspective, I think, is an important one. To the question that you raised at the beginning, it's such a good one. What does this idea of pressing mean? And when we came into this season, we were thinking about it around the organizations that you and I primarily serve, nonprofits, foundations, that they have a mission and they are trying to think about how to advance that mission. For a lot of them, 2020 threw out, the rule book, and they had to reimagine either how do we keep moving forward if it looks completely different than what we had on paper, making sure that above all else, we don't fall backwards. And a lot of organizations and institutions and industries have said, we will fall backwards, right? We are seeing this right now all across education. As we think about our kids and their experience, and kids who do not have the privilege that my kids have of having access to technology to have that process move them forward, right? There's a lot of falling back that we are seeing. Really, the spirit of this season is how are each of our guests thinking about this time as one that we can indeed continue to take steps forward, even with the barriers that are all around us. So there's a little bit of context there. But I love that you went right to history and perspective, right? That I wrote a blog a couple of weeks ago called A Time Like No Other, or Is It? And it played back. The opening line of the blog was actually pulled from an article that was around President Franklin Roosevelt's inauguration. You read the opening, and it might as well be today, right? So the opening line was, as security fears gripped its capital and a global calamity continued to claim the lives of hundreds of thousands of its citizens, the U.S. prepared for a presidential inauguration unlike any in its history.
That's perfect.
Might as well be today, right? So it's an interesting background and perspective you have, having been so deeply embedded in an understanding of history.
Well, and I think that's really important from in terms of American political history, because we look at the recent events and how disconnected we are and divided we are. And we're like so shocked that this could happen in the U.S. And yet, I mean, within my lifetime, the U.S. was like that back. I was born within a year maybe of Nixon resigning, and, the whole 60s and early 70s and Watergate and the rest of it, and not trusting government, and not to mention the Civil War. And if anything, I think at all levels, this past year has taught us who we really are. And it's tempting to think, oh, we've made so much progress and we're over all of our all of our stuff from the past. And as a country, I think we're just I don't even want to say at this point in the conversation that it's good or bad. It's before you say it's good or bad, you just have to say that it is, and that's for people's own lives, and it's for our life as a country.
Yeah. This past week, and so now this will be several weeks back when this airs, but the New York Times Magazine had a cover story, an illustration of a crew of painters painting a new coat onto the American flag, right? Looking at this tattered flag and putting a fresh coat onto it, which is an interesting statement to make, that our democracy has been hurt on a lot of levels. There's a lot of rebuilding that has to be put forward. And I agree with you. This is going to be as Ruth Bader Ginsburg said, who's right over my shoulder right now, in my office, that, change is incremental, right? It's small steps that make big change. Curious if that's what you're feeling too, right? There's no sweeping change necessarily that we're seeing right now, but it's small steps.
And you said earlier that there are a lot of organizations that have said we're falling backwards. So It's not just steps forward, it's steps backwards. And this pandemic hit in my 45th year, or I guess my 46th year, shortly after my 45th birthday. So for me, it kind of coincided with the midlife crisis that it's hard to differentiate, attribute different thoughts to each one. But I think any type of disruption like that, it is on many levels, it's a step backwards, and on other levels, it's a step forward. And when you think about long-term change, it is incremental, and it's the new insights that come out of a disruption like this. Would I be making some of the changes in my life? Would my midlife crisis have been as successful and effective without a global pandemic? I don't know. Would, whatever steps we're going to take in our democracy, since the conversation has kind of gone that way, and so don't make me do where it's Monday following the inauguration right now. So, obviously that has revealed major issues with our democratic process. I mean, we survived a coup attempt, but barely. I mean, this year, it is, my wife and I were talking about it last night. It's like, you could come up with like 5 Republicans that are either aligned with Trump or, long-standing Republicans, conservatives, that are responsible for the fact that our democracy still exists. I'm thinking of, 3 Trump-appointed justices on the Supreme Court, and I'm thinking of 2, Georgia, political elected officials. So what comes out of that, though? That's a major disruption and major awareness of weaknesses in our system. And what do we do with that is the question. And it might end up being a much better outcome than we would have had without Trump, without the pandemic.
That's right. It does seem like for as much of the experience of the last several years that we would have chosen not to have, it has certainly forced our society to make some change and face some hard realities that have been right in front of us for hundreds of years.
Yeah, and when I've said this often, when I look back at the things that I'm most grateful for in my life that have led me to grow the most, it's always the stuff that I never would have signed up for.
Today's episode is brought to you by Audible. Get a free audiobook download and 30-day free trial at audibletrial.com/Mission Forward. There's over 180,000 titles for you to choose from, including some of my favorites, like the book I'm reading now, Interior Chinatown by Charles Yu. It's both brilliantly funny and devastatingly honest about race, pop culture, immigration, and assimilation. And it's the winner of the 2020 National Book Award for Fiction. Visit audibletrial.com/Mission Forward to get your free audiobook today. I want to talk about this paper that you wrote recently, but before we do, I want you to give us some context for, your work and your purpose, which is so fascinating. So talk a little bit about the work that you do, and then let's talk about that most recent paper a little bit.
Well, you mentioned my purpose. I hope you tell me more about that, because I'm curious what that is. So if I had to name my purpose, especially coming out of, the past year or so, it really is helping people sit in the present with all these things, to apply that long-term perspective and to help people figure out what to do with it today. And so that paper was really a product of my own reflection on that, of, how do you respond in times like this, and recognizing it's not how you would respond other times. So the paper starts with a quote that I actually considered using from my first book on poverty. It's George Orwell from his first published novel called Down and Out in Paris and London. It essentially says poverty annihilates the future. And a lot of people use that quote to talk about how desperate and terrible poverty is. And in many ways it is. That just doesn't happen to be what George Orwell was saying. And what he was really saying is that because poverty annihilates the future, that's kind of the upside of it, because you don't have to worry about the future. He was in Paris and they had francs at the time. He said, if you have 100 francs in your pocket, then you got to worry about what you're going to do in the future, the next days and weeks. If you only have 3 francs in your pocket, that might be enough to eat for today, but you don't really have to think beyond that. So that's part of maybe the compassion for just focusing on getting through the day. And that's already a big achievement. And there's some grace in not having to think as much about, the future and what you're going to do next month or next year.
Do you think, as so many organizations had to just stop in their tracks, many of them had to completely pivot and think about their business model, how they deliver services, how they deliver their work, thinking certainly about, in this moment, I'm thinking a lot about healthcare and the delivery of healthcare, the rise up of telemedicine, right? Really challenging how certain work in connectivity gets done. That this idea that for so long, like as long as I've been in this work, organizations have mapped out their 5-year strategies, their 10-year strategies, right? They have put it all on paper on these are the steps we are going to do to be able to get to this, which takes into absolutely no account the world around us, right? And so it's fascinating then to have a moment like COVID that we all experienced in very, very different ways, but we all experienced it, how much it really did what you are saying, which is it's about the now. And we can look out a bit, right? But there's no planning and plotting the way that I think we had become accustomed to. And do you think that that's going to change? That perhaps people won't do the kind of 3-year, 5-year, 10-year planning the way they had because of this moment?
So I had a conversation a few months ago with a good friend and colleague, Kurt Wilson, and he and I wrote the paper that's on the BeyondCovid.live website, which is written early in the pandemic about how to plan your way out of the pandemic. And I think we talked about that on the community conversation we did. And we were just joking. We said, we always are telling clients, the whole 3 to 5 year plan with these detailed activities, by year 4 or 5, probably none of that stuff's going to be relevant. So let's do a light touch on that. And we were just joking. We never have to have that conversation again. We never have to explain, hey, things could happen that you don't expect. So that's another upside of the past year, I guess. Now, the question is, what does it look like when we do go back to planning for the future? I think that organizations need to assume a blank slate, at least at first. And they have to say, look, this is what we came together originally to do. Here are the underlying values. We came together to set up a food bank, and because we cared about food insecurity, and then like what's deeper below that, and then apply that into this new world, not assuming that any of the past context is going to stay the same. Now, a lot of it will, but some of it could change in way already has changed or could further change in ways we're not expecting. I've recently put out a paper with a friend and colleague, Dr. Les Wallace, who's here with me in Colorado. And we said, if you're having your first board meeting after all this, really treat your board members as if they're from another planet. They've just arrived, and then give them a brief on, okay, here's what it's like right now on planet Earth, and use that as the starting point to start thinking about the future and what do you want to do? Because there will be a lot that will be different.
Well, and that's a good transition because I know that that's something that you are doing and are looking to do more of, which is one of your great areas of expertise, facilitation. I ask about purpose. I would think, or at least from an outsider, seems like that is part of your purpose, that you are extremely skilled at that. Those meetings are very complicated, right? So tell us, what are some of the things that you're thinking about in terms of how you're arming those organizations to prepare for that first meeting back?
Well, the first one is to really ground the meeting and the conversations in a personal reconnecting among the people there. And I think even if you've been on Zoom calls with people for the past year, you're not as connected to them as you probably would like to be and as you would need to be to really dig in and plan a future together. So one of the points, for example, that we make in that paper is to really treat the first part of one of those sessions, your first in-person board meeting or workshop or retreat after the pandemic, or as the pandemic winds down anyway, optimistically. We talk about applying reintegration therapy with people in families where it's something really traumatic has happened. Maybe it's a really, brutal divorce and custody battle. And so a parent and a kid need to be reunited and reconnected. And there's a process for that. And there's a real intentionality around that. And I'd say for any executive director of a nonprofit and your board's coming back together, really focus on that. And people will know people who have died or have really been affected financially or health-wise. And if you don't explicitly create the context for them to share those types of experiences and reconnect in those relationships, and you just jump into, okay, here's our financial, here's our budget for next year and what should we do for strategy, I think that would be a mistake.
We're having someone on this season who is a culture expert, and we'll be talking more about what you just outlined there is a return to humanity first, right? That for a lot of organizations, they will come back and realize that the culture that they had built when they were all together maybe perhaps wasn't the most inclusive one. And so what I'm hearing from you loud and clear is something that we certainly work on and focus and should continue. All businesses should continue to work on this, is building that inclusive, human first, person first culture.
If the past year has taught us anything, it has taught us that we can't separate our, board member identity from our personal identity. I mean, we've had screaming kids in the background and barking dogs and, people coming to fix broken furnaces or whatever the heck it was.
Right.
And so we're all in, whether we want to admit it or not.
As we talk, my girls are next door, and I'm fairly certain it is virtual PE class right now as I hear a ball hitting against the wall. But you're right. It's the world we're in. One more thing about this paper. So you've got some quotes in here, and we will share this in the show notes so that folks know how to get it and find it. But you referenced the Stockdale paradox. Stockdale, as you know, as I think you know, certainly, he leaned on the Stoic philosophy during his time as a prisoner of war. He lived by this core tenet of Stoic philosophy that you don't control what happens to you. You control how you respond. I've tried to remember that and live that up every day as we start a day, trying not to set expectations for our kids when the day could change significantly intraday, right? How has 2020 changed how you respond to those challenges around you?
As a little more context for that paper, I have called myself a futurist, and I still do, but I've called myself a futurist for, 12 years now. And that's a big part of my professional identity. And so the whole experience of being a futurist with this long-term perspective at a time when people just really wanted to know what was going to happen next month. I mean, I've had to adjust that identity and come to terms with it. And a lot of my initial work in the pandemic was applying some of those futures tools to help people understand what the next year might look like, which is very different from looking, 10, 20 years out at how society could change as generations change and the rest of it. To some extent, this paper is a recharacterization of the role of a futurist. And I make a couple mentions to being a futurist. Part of me wonders if the attraction of the future to me is that, the present often stinks. So it's easier to talk about, the world will be great, 10 or 20 years from now, rather than facing, it's actually got some issues right now. So for me personally, this paper helps me come to terms with, what if you're not going to just escape to the future and talk about whiz-bang things that'll happen and social transformations that will have taken place, well, then how do you engage? And I think the Stockdale paradox speaks to that. In the paper, the part I quoted, basically it's Admiral Stockdale saying that the people who were least likely to make it out of the Hanoi Hilton, the prisoner of war prison that he spent a number of years in Vietnam, the people who are least likely to make it out were the optimists who just thought, we're going to be out of here by Christmas, and then Christmas would go and other holidays would go by and they were still there, and then they lost hope. And Viktor Frankl, the other author I quote in the piece, shared the same insight from his time in Auschwitz and other German concentration and death camps. And so it really is, how do you come to terms with what's going on right now, and how do you respond without just jumping to, okay, it's going to be great. At the same time, the future still has value, and Viktor Frankl speaks to that. So, but it's a different type of future, and it's a different way of conceiving your own relationship to the future. And that's what I was really trying to get at in the paper, because there's a paradox. If you're just living in the now, then you do get despondent and desperate. But if you're leaving the now and going off in the future, then you fall victim to the Stockdale paradox. So it's like any good consultant, I'll say it's both. The answer is yes,
right?
Yes, and
it's not. At least I would think it's not a call to forget the power of optimism, but not to rest on the laurels of optimism either, right? To think that it will just all be okay. It eventually will just get through this. Every single decision we collectively make today, whether we wear our mask or not, right? Whether we send our kids back or not, they all have an effect on the end goal, right? And so it's, how are we doing our best every day to live and do the best we can?
Yes, and playing my consultant card again.
Good.
Yes, and with respect to our kids, there's an opportunity to recognize their resilience. Early on in this experience, I just had the realization, like, this is their life. Like, I told the kids early on, I said, you're going to look back on this as a major piece of your childhood. And part of that was I wanted to communicate to them that I didn't think they were going to die. And the other piece of it was that it's true. They're going to respond to this in ways that I can't even anticipate. And maybe this will turn out to be a really hard thing that forces them to grow in ways that they then appreciate. Maybe it'll set them back and beyond what I can prevent. Not to just throw in the towel, but recognizing that the world, I do have faith in the world, and I probably have greater faith now than I did before the pandemic, and that faith in the resilience of humans to do their best. I think that's critical to surviving just the mental health challenge that is associated with what we've been through the past year.
There's a lot still to be determined, the effects of the time that we are in, that is for sure. We are already at the end, which is hard to believe because I've got so many more questions I want to ask you.
No, just the podcast.
Well,
darn it.
I'm not a futurist. I cannot say, nor can you on that one. But I do, as we're winding down here and wanting to leave folks with something to dig into more, to learn more about, to inspire their actions further. I'd love to see what's inspiring you. Is there a great idea you've come across, inspiration, a book, or anything else that you'd want to share?
I guess the biggest thing that I would draw inspiration from is just the gratitude to be alive when there's a lot of stuff happening that does challenge you. The past year has been really tough, and we have become more aware of things about ourselves and our country and our relationships than we otherwise would have become. So to the extent that is the platform from which to do better things in the future, I think there's a lot to be grateful for, and may we all seize that opportunity.
That's a great place to end. Well, Eric, I am so grateful for you and for your insights and thoughts and all the work you do. Thanks for being with us today.
Thanks, Carrie.